Hopefully we'll get to record that noise. That'll be good. I know a couple of you turned on your cameras. It's like, what the heck is going on? Is somebody strangling our professor? No, I'm allergic to stuff. I know it sounds so bad. So we're going to talk about Bacon's Rebellion here in a minute. I am going to mention that I'm slowly grading. I am so sorry. I will finish question 1 today. I'm question 2 tonight or tomorrow in the morning. So apologies for being slow on that. I think, is there anything else I'm supposed to tell you? Nah, I don't think so. I don't know. The other classes, they've been asking for feedback on their grades, but if you look in the grade section, they said if you click on it, then you can see the comments in, oh, sorry. Goodness. You can see the comments in the rubric. So, yeah. Am I supposed to say I don't have corona? Am I supposed to say that? Goodness. All right. So, and then the question for this week apparently has something to do with Bacon's Rebellion, doesn't it? So we'll talk about that here in a second. All right, let's talk about Bacon's Rebellion. We'll look at the question again, unless I close all the stuff, which is possible. That's weekly question comments. I don't want you to see that. Weekly question. Here we go. Am I sharing it? I'm probably not, am I? Okay, let me get the notes. I am so sorry. The other classes I just yawned through. I didn't cough like I was dying. So. And I had corona shot number 1. So, goodness, I don't know how I got it either. It's confusing. No, I went to a football stadium and they gave me one. It was weird. Oh, dang it. Okay. All right, good. This is what I wanted to look at. All right. So let's just do that. Goodness. Class may last about 2 minutes. We'll see. All right. Is this you? This is you. How and why tobacco planters, that coughing hurts your head. How and why tobacco planters in the Chesapeake region, we're talking Virginia, Maryland, you know, where they grow tobacco, came to rely on African slaves rather than European indentured servants over the course of the 17th century, that'd be the 1600s. At what point did the Chesapeake become a slave society rather than merely a society with slaves? And you know, I've seen this weird thing looking at the textbook, and I noticed that there's some stuff in there that'd be super helpful for this chapter. So I'm going to suggest that you peek at some stuff, and you guys can type it to each other in the notes or something if you want. But if you will look at, sorry, I'm so sorry. You will look at the section where it talks about, there's a whole thing about slavery and the law. I would probably start around page 100, 101-ish. And then you've got the Bacon's Rebellion review on 102. And they have the picture of Berkeley. You'll go like, that dude's not tough. But you know, they weren't supposed to look tough back then. And also it's a painting. He probably didn't look like that at all. But sorry, start around page 100. Bacon's Rebellion's on 102. And then there's a section called A Slave Society, the End of the Rebellion, Its Consequences, on page 106. At the end of that section that says the end of the rebellion, and we're still talking about Bacon's Rebellion. I'm not putting it off, why I'm putting it off, but I'm not forgetting. We'll talk about it in a second. But at the end of the section about Bacon's Rebellion, it says some crazy stuff in your book, like, the authorities said, you know what, we're going to make life easier for people who live here, be more aggressive towards Native Americans. They withdrew, they sent Berkeley back to England with his little wig and fancy outfit and stuff. And, or maybe not, maybe he had to leave it back in the colony. But it says to avert the further growth of a rebellious population of landless former indentured servants, Virginia's authorities accelerated the shift to slaves who would never become free on the tobacco plantation. As Virginia reduced the number of indentured servants, it redefined their freedom dues to 50 acres of land. So that way there's no, fight over what you get. You get 50 acres of land, whether it's good or bad land, that's a whole different thing. But part of the reason that the Chesapeake region decided, you know what, we're not using slavery anymore, is because of Bacon's Rebellion. And I know that's why you want to talk about it. It makes sense. It's a good question. I admire you for asking. Daniel, dang it, we're not letting Daniel in. Huh. But I don't see in the thing, the thing where it tells you to let people in. Yeah, that didn't make it any better. Oh, and now you see, what do you see on your screen now? Do you see the weekly question again?
Okay. We still see the notes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, tell Daniel I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not trying to not let him in. For whatever reason, he's not showing up on the screen. Okay, so you see the notes and not the weekly question? Or do you see the weekly question? Do you see the notes? What? Dang.
I see the weekly questions.
Okay. I don't know what I see. I see stars because I
keep the weekly question. That's my
no,
bad.
you're good. Don't worry at all. I see stars because I keep coughing. So around page 100, give or take a page or two, is where you want to look for a little bit of an assist on this question. So let's go back. We'll talk about Bacon's Rebellion, because Bacon's Rebellion is pretty crucial to this question, because that's really the point of change. The point of change. It's part of the reason they changed their minds about whatever. I don't see Daniel. I don't see him in the list of people that want to come in. So, oh, there he is. Okay. All right. You guys can tell Daniel in the chat that I was just being a jerk and wouldn't let him in. It's like, she saw you the whole time. Just doesn't like you. Not true. Not true. Excuse me. I'm allergic to Daniel. Oh, gosh. Let's look at the note. I'm opening the notes because I feel like bacon is in the notes. I had some bacon in my potato soup the other night too, but that was not Nathaniel bacon, was it? No, don't be stupid, Sarna. All right, here we go. Bacon's Rebellion. Here we go. 1676. Hey, some more people are coming. You darn kids, you're probably working on your physics. I know how you kids are. All right, darn late kids working on the physics. That's what always happened when I taught U.S. history in person at Cedar Park High School. Why physics? Why does that matter more than every other class in the history of the world? Okay. Sometimes pre-cal. Bacon's Rebellion. So that's what we're talking about. So whenever this says, 1675, 1676. Nathaniel Bacon's kind of an upper middle classish sort of dude. He's doing pretty well. He got his land. He's doing okay. But he wants to be a super wealthy dude. It's going to be hard for him to become a super wealthy dude by getting land, because most of the best land's already taken up. So rather than, trying to buy land, he thought, well, you know what? Maybe I could be a fur trader, because what sounds more fun than being a fur trader? And they gave out, the colonial government, the governor, Berkeley, gave out fur trading licenses, but they didn't give out too many fur trading licenses. Oops, sorry. Because if you give out too many fur trading licenses, then there's not enough little animals for you to skin to make whatever you made out of their little fur. So too many people hunting for the little animals means you don't, or the large animals, means you don't get enough animals. You know what? I never really thought about what sort of animals they're using for fur in that region. I know they probably used the beaver because they made those hats, that we know about. Do you think they use squirrels? That's what I would use in my backyard. There's so many squirrels. Okay. Maybe there's some bears of some sort. I don't know. But anyway, you don't care about that. And neither did Bacon, because he didn't get the fur trading license and he was frustrated. It's like, dang it. they're discriminating against me because I'm irritating because I used to be an indentured servant. And so he starts a rebellion and he says, you know what, our colony is not protecting the economic opportunity, the rights of people, especially who used to be indentured servants. So they won't run off the Native Americans so we can grab more land because, you know, the governor's really representing the people who are already wealthy and they already have their land. So it's like, let's not upset the Native Americans because we're fairly happy with the amount of land we have. And the Native Americans trade with us, so that's pretty cool. Let's just leave them alone. Everything's going cool for us. But the poor people's like, dang, we can't get any land because you're not running the Native Americans off. So maybe you should do that. And then the governor's like, no, that'll cause a war. And we really don't want to do that. And then the middle classish, poorish people go like, yeah, well, we want you to do that because you're not protecting us. Build a wall. They didn't say build a wall, but make Virginia great again. I don't know what they said, but they did want more land. And the governor was just not about that. He wasn't going to do it. So Bacon and at least 12 people signed the petition of rebellion, and they decide they'll form their own militia and they'll attack Native Americans. That would never have any bad consequences. And they also, as a point of rebellion, burned down Jamestown. And then Nathaniel Bacon gets dysentery and dies. So the rebellion collapses, but the feeling behind the rebellion makes the leaders of the colony rethink some stuff. So one of the things they rethink is do we let former indentured servants have some land? How much? Who determines? And so they just passed like a basic law that said you get 50 acres. It isn't a whole lot, but 50 acres. It'd be a lot if you had to mow it. See, I always think of land and how long does it take me to mow the yard? Thankfully, my yard is not an acre. Back when I lived in Missouri, it was about 3/4 of an acre when I was a little kid, and we had a giant garden and stuff, and it seemed really big. But if you're a farmer, yeah, 50 acres, not that big. So it's kind of a small amount of farmland. And then the rich guys go, you know what? If we just don't have any more indentured servants, we're not going to have to deal with these people who think that they deserve some rights. So if you get rid of the class of people who might eventually gain their freedom, and the book also will chronicle how they changed the laws to make sure that former slaves, African slaves, were less and less able to gain their freedom because in the early days you could work, maybe buy your freedom, buy some land, that kind of stuff. That is going to be less and less likely the closer we get to the United States becoming the United States. I'm sorry, the colonies becoming the United States. So Bacon's Rebellion really is kind of an eye-opening event for the wealthier land-owning class in that region, the Chesapeake in Virginia, who said, you know what, if we just make sure there's no more white guys that might potentially get some land, our lives will be easier. So they switch away. And you've also got more plantation slave families moving into the Carolinas. So that's starting to become more of a thing. And in Maryland, it's also, I mean, you see that some as well. And Maryland goes through their own little rebellion, kind of a Protestant backlash to the Catholic rule, which isn't particularly harsh. They just don't like it because it's Catholic. And that's that part of the country where it's like Catholics shouldn't have any rights. And then there'll be a little pushback, but they're also going to start ending indentured servitude as well. So this is the era where it starts to end, in part because of Bacon's Rebellion, but in part because of, you see larger importation of slaves from the sugar plantation region. Okay.
So I have a question.
Okay, let's see if I have an answer.
So with indentured servants, if they're coming from Europe and they're supposed to be indentured servants in America,
Yeah.
then how does Virginia just say we don't want them?
Well, you don't have to offer somebody that opportunity, because the reason they got to come over is that you paid their trip over, and that's why they were indentured to you. And they may have owed, you paid off their debt because they were probably in debtor's prison, and you paid for their passage over. So they worked long enough to pay off the debt you paid off, plus the passage over, which was getting cheaper. Also, enough of those folks had come over, and the laws were starting to change in England about debtors' prisons, which seemed just uniquely unfair, because once you get in there, you really can't get out. So there were fewer people in that spot in England as well. And the one thing you'll notice in the next chapter is you can just ship those folks to Georgia in about the next 50 years. So there's not as much of a need for that. There aren't as many debtors who want to come over. Plus, they're pesky. You got to pay them at the end, and they should have rights. So
Yeah, they believe they're entitled to freedom.
yeah,
and
yeah,
rights.
yeah, and they'll change the laws enough in that region that former slaves will still get to be free, but there is not going to be a way for African slaves of African descent to gain their freedom much after this time period because of the law changes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's when people start to see the slaves as more of an investment. And again, that's not to suggest that they treat them well. We already know that they don't, but a long-term investment, and also you get to own their kids, which is why they see it as a long-term investment, which I know is a horrible way to see owning a person. Well, just owning a person, that seems pretty obvious. Yeah, we're opposed to that in the modern era. So, all right, okay. Does anybody want to know anything else? Is that enough about Bacon's Rebellion? Somebody in my other class asked me, it was a really good question. It's like, when did Wall Street start to become important? It's like, I'm not here for that. So I told him, I said, I'm like the new press secretary for the White House. I'll circle back to you on that. Yes. Okay. I got to look it up. I don't know. I told him I knew during this era that it started to become important, but it was the 1302 class when, Gilded Age and money starts to become a big deal. All right. I feel like I've talked so long and we just started class. Goodness. Okay. I'm recording me talking, complaining that I talked too long. Okay. Did we talk about Dominion of New England? I was noticing when I was grading question 1, and I apologize to like the 3 or 4 of you that I haven't finished yet. I'm so sorry. But I'll finish today. I promise, with question 1, and tomorrow with question 2. I'm so sorry that I got behind. Can we talk about Catholic and Protestant again just one more time? I'll keep it short, okay? But in that question number 1, I got a whole lot of, well, the Europeans came over to spread Catholicism. Like maybe, and maybe not. So I just want to point out that not all Europeans are Catholic. Most Europeans are Christian. Most Spanish folks, Catholic. Portuguese folks, Catholic. French, kind of half and half. Where else are there a lot of Catholics? England, there's some, but they're more Protestant at that point. What other country did I leave out? The Dutch, they don't care. The Dutch, they're interesting because most of the really important kind of, I don't know that creative is the right word, but theologians who really view salvation in a different way and kind of move away from predestination toward free will, the idea that every individual gets to choose whether they accept Christ or not, rather than it's predetermined. Almost all of those guys are Dutch, which is interesting because it's a fairly secular society. You're going, it's not interesting at all. I'm sorry. Why was I talking about this? I don't even remember now. I'm sorry. My head hurts from all the coughing. Because of question number 1. And not everybody in Europe is Catholic. Germans. Yeah, there's some German Catholics. Although this chapter and the next, mostly this chapter, talks about all the Germans who moved to the Americas because they're in the wrong religion. And it really depends on which region of Germany you live in, because there's lots of Lutherans in Germany, because, you know, Martin Luther was one of their dudes. And those guys are Protestants. So not everybody who's Catholic, or not everybody who's Christian is Catholic, but everybody who's Catholic is Christian. And if they're not Catholic, they're Protestant, and not all Europeans are Catholic. And English, especially, not so Catholic by the time you start to see colonization. So anytime you're talking about English immigrants to the United States, you are probably talking about Protestants. Just trust me on this. Just trust me. Okay. But when you're talking about Spanish folks, you're almost always talking about Catholics, almost always. And same with Portuguese. Catholics and Portuguese love, or excuse me, Spanish and Portuguese love the church, big C, Catholic Church. And pretty much everybody else is kind of split, except for England, which is mostly Protestant. Okay. Are we done talking about religion? No, because I see Salem witch trials. So we're probably not done talking about religion, are we? We've talked about the Salem witch trials before, so I'll just remind you, they still happened. And the book also mentions that there's a whole lot more let's persecute the witches going on in Europe. It happens occasionally in the United States. This is the American colonies. This is the biggest instance of witch trial-ery at the Salem witch trials. And 200 folks accused, 19 people executed. And certainly this was very disruptive in the community of Salem and the neighboring communities, most notably Boston and any community where they had scholarly folks said, Salem, what the heck, you're making us look bad. So, but Salem said, you don't tell us what to do, you're not the boss of me. So they did this foolishness until somebody had a dream that the mayor's wife was a witch, and then they go like, hey, we're done with the witch trials. So my guess is a lot of people thought we should have had that dream sooner. Wish we would have. And the book also talks about the West African slave servant Tituba and how some kids blamed her for stuff, which was easy to do because, you know, during this era, if people weren't part of your culture, you knew they were wrong and had some terrible ideas. So it was really easy to blame the foreigner. So they did. And especially non-Christian foreigners, you know, they're a bunch of witches. So, all right. I don't know, is that, do we need to talk more about the Salem witch trials? I feel like we did the other day. I feel like it's the only thing from this era in US history that you go over 82 million times, even in your English classes. So the only thing I would remember, kind of back in my head sort of thing, because I know you've got most of the details, is even though it's a terribly heinous thing, I'm not trying to understate it at all. It's 19 people and one very isolated event, and really not even close to typical for Puritans, who tended to, except for in Salem, tended to like science, and they were kind of early adopters of things like early vaccines and lived more moderate lives. And yeah, I don't know what was going on in Salem. All sorts of theories though. Oh, one of the other things I was sort of talking about to myself when class started. It seems like this was a class where somebody suggested something was up with the book review assignment. I went back and looked, and I think the person that I suggested, like if you just can't think of anybody to read a book about, my dude was Frederick Douglass, just because he's super interesting and really important, and probably not studied, definitely not studied enough in US history. And that narrative of the life's a really interesting book. But, you know, if you got something you want to read more, pick that. But the book review, the assignment really is for stuff that goes up to the Civil War. So anything that involves the United States or pre-United States and happens before the Civil War or during the Civil War is completely legitimate. Yep, you can absolutely read about that. I feel like last time we talked a little about the Glorious Revolution. I think we didn't talk about Jacob Leisler, which is a stupid, weird thing. Okay, so the Leisler guy, he's not quite right. Something's off in his brain a little. I don't know what's going on. But he lives in New York, And he is not a huge fan of James II. So when James II is the king, he takes over a fort in New York. And the book mentions that he's German born. I don't know. You probably could have guessed that from the name. But he decides that he is going to, let's see, your book says, he takes a fort in New York. The book doesn't really talk about this, but the book talks about it in general. And he takes it in the name of William and Mary, who represent a different faction who eventually comes to power in England, and he won't relinquish the fort. And then William and Mary overthrow James in the nice, peaceful, glorious revolution where no one dies. And then they demand that Leisler return the fort, and he won't. Yeah. And he says, I took this in the name of William and Mary. And they go like, we work for them. And they said, give the fort back. And he goes, no, I will not relinquish the fort. I should be in charge. I took this in the name of William and Mary. And they're like, dude, if you don't give it back, we're going to charge you with treason. And it's not going to go well. So he doesn't give it back. They charge him with treason. It doesn't go well. They capture him and they execute him in a very public and gruesome sort of way. And the book describes it a little. There's all sorts of stuff written about this because it must have been fairly gruesome, where they cut him in pieces and pull out part of the body parts. And I've read one account where it says that they pull out some of his intestines while he's still alive and kind of cook them in front of him. So something terrible happens to Leisler. Now, eventually they're going to pardon him, but it's after he's dead. So that pardon after you're dead, not so useful. Not so useful. No, I know. If I'm ever going to get pardoned for something, I hope it happens while I'm alive and certainly before I'm executed for something. Okay. All right. And it seems like I didn't make a whole lot of notes about stuff that happens after the Salem witch trials, but is in your book. So let me just mention that stuff changes in the colonies a little bit during this region. You see lots of new folks immigrating from not England. So you see people from Scotland and Ireland who aren't indentured servants, but they might be poor. Germany. Oh, I'm going to sneeze again. Excuse me. And some colder places, Norway, Sweden, those sorts of places, the blonde people come over. So people come over during this time period from a variety of different places. And so it's going to enhance the diversity of the American colonies. And they'll come over with different customs. There's lots of Dutch families that are still there and have kind of taken over, not taken over, but enhanced their estates in New York as well. So there's some large farms that are developing. Some people come over with money and buy farmland in Western Pennsylvania, but also you see the growth of cities during this time period, not the way that you see it back in Europe where, most of the population lives in large cities. That doesn't happen in the United States until after the Civil War. But you do see the growth of cities, and cities become a place where you go for trade, if you want to buy something from another country, or there'll be artisans who live there who make replicas of stuff. Like there's some sort of furniture that becomes really trendy during this time period. Clearly, I don't have it at my house because I don't know anything about it, called Chippendale furniture. And they start to make replicas of that, especially in Philadelphia. But a lot of the imported goods that were trendy from England, some of the artisans will make, I guess, copies of those in the major cities along the coast. So you go to major cities to buy cool stuff or to sell whatever it is that you grow and trade it for cool stuff. So cities become important culturally, and they become important economically, even though they're not, the hubs of population. There's not a majority of people that live in cities. And also the book mentions that certain prominent families start to rise during this time period. And they talk about Thomas Jefferson's family and George Washington's family, who start to gain some prominence in their regions. Excuse me for the yawn. They also mention, and there's a little excerpt from some stuff from Ben Franklin, who's, fairly international dude, and we'll talk more about him as kind of the Enlightenment fellow. And next chapter, we'll talk a little bit more about Enlightenment and Great Awakening. Although I know that I mentioned it in the, hey, study this for chapter 3. There's really more of it in chapter 4. There's an excerpt, I think, in chapter 3 from a Benjamin Franklin observation. Ben Franklin writes a bunch of stuff down. And he's pretty honest. So I think one of you said you were going to read an autobiography of Ben Franklin. You're going to find out some stuff about that dude that is not like elementary school appropriate. He's a little out of control at times. And he's like out of control grandpa because he continues to be nutty, like go visit prostitutes and stuff. When he's in his 70s, it's like, Grandpa, yeah, I know, I'm surprised as well. Like, calm down, Grandpa. What are you doing? But he also is like, here are the 10 ways that I can improve my life, be more like Jesus and Socrates or whoever he says he wants to be like. It's like, dude, last night you were not like Jesus or Socrates. But he's going to write in the excerpt in your book about why do we have to have all these Germans? It's not exactly what he's saying. He's particularly not a fan of Germans. And he lives in Philadelphia, so he gets to see a lot of Germans. But he really just not cool with who he calls aliens coming, and that would have been a proper term for his time period. But he's not cool with all the dang immigrants coming in that won't speak any English. So you're going to look at it like, Ben, you're supposed to be enlightened. He is enlightened for the time period, but he's not super excited about not English guys sometimes. It's hard. I mean, because these guys, we want him to be perfect. And we go like, no, he knew about electricity. He flew a kite. He's pretty open-minded. For his time period, he is. But he does think England is very cool. And if you don't speak English, you're essentially a barbarian. The same sort of thoughts that the Greeks had about, if you didn't speak Greek, you were a barbarian. So I guess people are just, they're proud. They're proud of their heritage. And of course it's better because it's what you are. So the reason I point this out, we're an increasingly diverse country, even before we're a country. There's all sorts of folks from all sorts of places in ways that other countries don't experience this, except maybe the Dutch, because they're open to stuff, but they're small and it's not our history, so I guess we don't care as much. And mostly again, because they're small. The United States, really big. So there's a whole bunch of immigrants, there's this mixing of cultures, but it's not really a mixing because the different cultures really stay pretty separate. So it's not like there's a big, a melting pot or anything. People aren't necessarily sharing all their values and stuff, although, the food, we're all pretty good with other people's food. But you will notice, especially in cities, that there'll be newspapers printed in all sorts of different languages. There'll be churches, denominations from all around the world. So, you'll have some Baptists and Methodists and Lutherans, and you'll even have some Jews in some of the major cities, which turns out fine. Nobody gets terribly distressed about it. And occasionally some Muslims, not too many Muslims, but occasionally some Muslims. So you're going to have the presence of lots of different cultures early in American history, even before we're the United States. It doesn't necessarily mean that all those cultures blend and mix well and that people from different cultures respect each other. They may or may not. So the book talks about a growing diversity, an ethnic diversity, a growing economic diversity, people making their livings in different ways. And it also talks about the development of social classes. Seems like we always have that, don't we? And one of the things you'll notice all throughout American and eventually US history, colonial US history, history even now, is that especially if your family has money, there are different rules for you. Because if you marry someone, you have to marry someone else with money, otherwise your family won't have money anymore. So when you're in the upper social classes, and in most regions, with the exception of Puritans, because they're not really supposed to be wealthy, although some of them are, you're supposed to marry someone who's like you, socioeconomically. And it's also very important that you marry someone who's like you ethnically, typically in those socioeconomic groups. Now, historically, no one cares what poor people do. So there's all sorts of intermarriage combinations. People even have kids and they're not married. They don't have official marriages. They probably had sex before they were married. I don't know. We don't record stuff like that. But poor people, no one cares what they do. There's really no social rules for them at certain times. Now, that's going to change, when we get closer to what we think of as the Civil War, and the South develops a little differently than the North. But in this era, with everybody immigrating, like if you're English and you marry a Scottish person, nobody cares. And there are going to be some societies where if you marry somebody who's a different, what we would think of as race than you, that probably no one would care. But those are fewer and farther between. So you'll see some mixing of people of different ethnic groups, and that as long as they're poor, no one really cares. You'll see some mixing of different people, of different racial groups. Typically, as long as they're poor and they're not prominent, nobody cares. But I mean, you have some interesting situations like with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, where Thomas Jefferson is not poor. He's a fairly prominent fellow, and his girlfriend is Black. And that comes up. It does come up during the time period. Because I remember when we started talking about that more historically, it was in the 1970s, because I was a little kid. And I thought, well, surely they must have known this, because Thomas Jefferson was not a real secretive kind of guy. I mean, he was like to keep to himself, but he was a public figure. And, it was talked about in newspapers back in the times, well, not that we're studying, but a little later, because we need Jefferson to be born first. But mixing of different social classes as a rule is a problem. And again, with poor people, people don't typically care. And during this era, there's going to be probably more racial mixing, because there's really not as much established government in every colony. I know every colony's got a royal governor that's appointed, and most of them have some sort of representative assembly, but those represent large landowners. If you're a small landowner, an artisan, you're kind of on the fringes of society, people don't care as much. They don't. And I don't want to say that people are accepting of it. It's just people don't see you. They don't notice you. Once a society becomes more strict and more governed, and they start to develop more laws about that stuff, interracial marriage will become illegal. I'm not saying, that all that stuff is fine all throughout US history. That it's not. But they also remind you of how the trade works in this part of the world, the Atlantic trade. So you've got stuff that's grown in what will become the United States, the American colonies, primarily grain crops. They also harvest a lot of, I don't know if that's the right word, catch a lot of fish and dry them and send them places, and timber, that sort of stuff, lumber. So flour, grain crops, that kind of stuff that leave here. The food typically goes to the West Indies. In the West Indies, they grow sugar, maybe some fruits, but it's primarily sugar. And they might distill it into rum there, or that might magically turn into rum somewhere else. And the crops, manufactured goods come from England to both those places, and slaves come from Africa or from the Spanish, the Dutch, and the Portuguese as a rule. There aren't so many English folks who go and capture slaves, although it does happen, but they certainly trade for slaves. So, and we've talked before, most of the slaves go to South America and the Caribbean or the Caribbean, but this is the era once they end the use of indentured servants that you start to see more slaves coming to North America. And I'm not suggesting that they didn't use slaves before this. It just wasn't the majority at first, but it didn't take very long, you know, maybe 40, 50 years at most. So, all right. So social classes, really like social classes all the time, everywhere throughout history. If you have more money, you're ranked higher in social classes. They're also going to point out that trade connects the different colonies. Religion, kind of, sort of, because almost everybody is some version of Protestant. And the Second Great Awakening, which next chapter, will connect people more by religion, because part of the push of that movement is really to be more accepting of other Christians, you know, not to be all snooty about which branch of Christianity you might be a part of, especially Protestants. Dang, that's confusing, isn't it? Protestants, there's like 8 million of them. And during this time period, there were many different denominations of Protestants as well. I mean, that didn't just start in the United States. It started long before. And the other thing that unifies the different colonies is the language of trade, which is English. So no matter where you're from, if you want to be successful in trade, you want to make some money, English is probably going to be the language you need to learn. So, yeah. So the rest of the chapter that I didn't make very many notes about really talks about how the colonies become more diverse in a lot of ways, but connected by language and trade. And even that diversity is not what we think of as modern diversity, where, you know, cultures blend and there's a lot of intermarriage, and, you know, we have restaurants and eat each other's foods. And when you go to the family reunion, you see people of all different ethnicities. Maybe, I don't know, you might. I know that, yeah, when I go, I tend to. But, you know, they're not, the cultures aren't necessarily mixing, they're just more present. And in working class areas, maybe in cities, you start to see more mixing. But as the colonies become more regimented, become more, they have more laws and rules and things like that, and really more people to enforce those laws and rules, that becomes different. And if you're looking for religious groups who go like, oh, let's all just love each other no matter where we're from, you do see some of that during the Second Great Awakening. Oh, you see a lot of that in the Second Great Awakening. You see a little of that in the First Great Awakening. But you see that mostly from our friends, the Quakers, who do love everyone, because, you know, they're Quakers. It's what they do. All right. I feel like I've talked forever. Does it feel like that to you? This is where you say, no, that was the most fascinating lecture ever. But before we go, which we'll need to do here in a few minutes, do you have any questions or anything you want to ask? And I've got to double check on the roll. I think I got everybody. Let me look. Yeah, I did. You're all here. What a day.
So when we had you junior year for our first semester, you let us do test correction on
Yeah.
the quizzes and exams. Will we be allowed to do that for this
What,
class or no?
what the heck was I thinking? I let you do test corrections? Did we have the pandemic? Is that why I let you do that? Was it last spring?
It was when we were juniors, so we're seniors this year.
But was it last fall?
It was
Were we in
2019 fall.
Oh, crud. I had just retired. I was just happy then. No, in person, because I haven't been letting people do test corrections because half the stuff ahead of time, you have all the questions. And I've given you a pretty good list. But after you take the first quiz, if you feel like we need to renegotiate that, we can. And if after you've gotten grades on the first couple of questions, if you feel like we need to renegotiate, we can. I will notice, here are things that I noticed when I did grades last semester. There were some people who got like 100% on the quizzes, but did a really crappy job on the questions. You can probably guess what I suspected went on there. And I'm sure I was right. They were cheating on the quizzes and doing a very poor job on the day-to-day work. I'm going to be much more friendly to you if your weekly questions are good and your quizzes are a little, you know what I'm saying? Because I feel like that's going to be more of an honest representation. But I got to do a little of the quizzing thing too. But I will say, especially last semester, my grades were really high for me, much higher than probably you saw when we were in person. But you know, when we shifted, did I stop recording?